A busy morning in London. The local coffee shop is humming with the sound of grinding beans and rushed conversations. In a quiet corner, a woman sits alone with her laptop. Three aggressive men surround her, their voices rising, their intentions clear. The other customers look away, staring intently at their phones. The woman remains calm, but the fear in her eyes is unmistakable. Suddenly, Daniel Carter, a 40-year-old single dad, steps forward with his young daughter. He doesn't shout, he doesn't fight. He simply stands between them and says, "She asked you to leave." He had no idea. She was a billionaire power CEO. Daniel Carter was the kind of man the world often looked past. At 40 years old, he was a master of the small and the broken. He owned a tiny electronics repair shop in a quiet corner of London, a cramped but cozy space filled with the scent of ozone, solder, and the ghosts of old machinery. Daniel had a gift for fixing things that others deemed worthless. To him, a cracked screen or a silent motherboard wasn't trash. It was a puzzle waiting for a patient hand. He found beauty in the discarded. But the most important thing he had ever fixed was his own soul after the devastating loss of his wife 4 years ago. It had taken time and a lot of tears, but he had rebuilt a life for himself that was quiet, steady, and honest. Since then, Daniel's world had revolved entirely around his 9-year-old daughter, Sophie. Sophie was his compass, his reason for waking up when the grief felt like a lead blanket. She had her mother's curly hair and a curious spirit that could find wonder in a rain puddle or a discarded circuit board. Daniel's primary mission in life was simple: to raise Sophie to be strong, resilient, and above all, to be kind. "The world is loud and often selfish, Sophie," he would tell her every morning while brushing her hair. "But kindness is the only thing that actually echoes. It's the only mark you leave that doesn't fade." Every morning before school, the two of them had a ritual that neither of them would miss for anything. They would stop at the Roasted Bean, a bustling coffee shop near the park. It was a place of routine and comfort. Daniel would get his black coffee, Sophie would get her hot chocolate with extra foam, and they would spend 15 minutes talking about her dreams of becoming a marine biologist or her latest drawing of a narwhal. Daniel was well known in the neighborhood as the quiet fixer, the man who would fix a neighbor's toaster for free or help an elderly lady cross the street without a second thought. He didn't have much money, but he had an abundance of respect. On this particular Tuesday, the shop was packed. The air was a heavy cocktail of industrial-grade lavender cleaner, old coffee, and the metallic, unmistakable tang of wet umbrellas. Businessmen in sharp suits were barking into their Bluetooth headsets. Students were hunched over glowing textbooks, and the line for the counter snaked out the door. In the far corner, tucked away near a dusty bookshelf full of forgotten novels, sat Victoria Blake. Victoria was 34, brilliant, and currently the most powerful woman in the London financial district. As the CEO of Blake International, a multi-billion-dollar investment firm, her face was usually on the cover of magazines or the lead story on financial news networks. But today, she was hiding. She wore a simple gray hoodie, no makeup, and thick-rimmed glasses that obscured her striking green eyes. She loved this coffee shop because, for 30 minutes a day, she could just be Victoria. She didn't have to be the billionaire. She didn't have to be the boss. She didn't have to worry about the stock market or the hostile takeover bids that plagued her nights. She was just a woman with a laptop and a cold brew. However, her peace was about to be shattered. Three men, younger associates from a rival firm who had been trying to force her into a predatory merger, had tracked her down. They were desperate for her signature, and they didn't care about the sanctity of her mourning. They saw a woman they thought was vulnerable because she was alone, and they moved in like wolves scenting a weak point in the pack. They stood over her table, their expensive shadows blocking her light. Their voices were low but menacing, filled with the arrogance of people who believe that a high net worth gives them the right to occupy someone else's personal space. The rest of the shop went quiet in that specific, uncomfortable way. People lowered their heads, They adjusted their headphones. They looked out the window at the gray London drizzle. No one wanted to get involved in what looked like a private dispute. The injustice of the silence was deafening. Victoria gripped her coffee cup, her knuckles white, her eyes darting toward the exit. She felt the cold hand of panic beginning to tighten around her throat. Daniel had just received his coffee when he saw the situation unfolding. He didn't see a CEO. He didn't see a business deal or a corporate rival. He saw a human being who was being cornered and intimidated. He looked down at Sophie, who was watching the scene with wide, worried eyes. He remembered his own words about kindness echoing. He knew that if he walked away now, he was teaching his daughter that silence was acceptable in the face of bullying. He was teaching her that the quiet fixer only fixed machines, not people. He didn't hesitate. He handed his coffee to Sophie and whispered, "Stay right here for a second, sweetheart. Watch the bag." Daniel walked toward the corner. He didn't run. He didn't puff out his chest or start a fight. He just moved with the steady, immovable gravity of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He stopped right next to Victoria's table, his presence cutting through the aggression of the three men like a cool breeze through a fever. The three men stopped talking and turned to look at Daniel. They were tall, dressed in expensive wool coats that probably cost more than Daniel's car, and they smelled of arrogance and luxury cologne. The leader, a man with a sharp jawline and an even sharper sneer, looked Daniel up and down with visible disgust. He saw a man in a faded work jacket with oil-stained jeans and calloused hands. "Can we help you, mate?" the leader asked, his voice dripping with a condescension that could have peeled paint. "We're in the middle of something important. This is high-level business. Go back to your kid and your cheap coffee." Daniel didn't blink. He stood his ground, his feet planted firmly on the wooden floor like he was anchored to the earth. He looked at Victoria, who was staring at him in utter shock. She had never seen a man step in between her and trouble without an army of security guards behind him. Then, Daniel looked back at the men. "The lady asked you to leave," Daniel said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a resonant, vibrating authority that silenced the table next to them. "You're taking up her space, you're blocking her light, and you're making people uncomfortable. It's time for you to go." The second man laughed, a jagged, ugly sound. "Do you even know who you're talking to? We're with Sterling Holdings. We're in the middle of a multi-million-pound negotiation. You're just a repairman. Walk away before you lose more than just your dignity. You could lose your livelihood if we make a few calls." Daniel felt a small, warm hand slip into his. He looked down. Sophie had followed him. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was standing right behind her father. Her small fingers gripped tightly around his hand. She didn't say a word, but her presence changed the energy of the room. It was no longer a confrontation between a man and bullies. It was a father showing his daughter what it meant to be a man of character. "I don't care who you work for or how many calls you can make," Daniel said, his voice gaining a hard, steel-like edge. "In this shop and in this city, we respect people. You have 10 seconds to leave on your own, or I'll find the manager and we can have a very different conversation with the police. And trust me, you don't want to be the reason a 9-year-old girl thinks men are nothing but cowards in suits." The leader of the group looked around the room. He realized the dynamic had shifted. Other customers were starting to look up. A few people were reaching for their phones to record the scene. The quiet fixer had broken the spell of silence, and now the room was watching. The risk of a public PR disaster was starting to outweigh the reward of their intimidation. With a final, hateful glance at Victoria, the leader straightened his silk tie. "This isn't over," he hissed at her. Then, he looked at Daniel. "Enjoy your 15 minutes of fame, hero. It's the only victory you'll ever have. People like you don't survive in the real world." The three men turned and marched out of the shop, the bell at the door chiming mockingly behind them as they stepped into the rain. The atmosphere in the shop shifted instantly. The tension evaporated, replaced by the low hum of resumed conversations. Victoria sat there for a moment, her chest heaving, her hands finally relaxing their grip on the paper cup. She looked up at Daniel, and for the first time in years, she felt truly seen. Not as a CEO, not as a target for a merger, but as a person who had been rescued by a stranger. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I, I'm not used to people doing that. Most people in my world just, calculate the risk and stay silent." Daniel gave her a small, tired, but sincere smile. He knelt down to Sophie's level and ruffled her hair. "Are you okay, Soph? You did great. You were brave, Papa," the little girl whispered, her eyes shining with a pride that was worth more than any bank account Victoria had ever managed. Daniel turned back to Victoria. "It was the right thing to do. My daughter was watching, and I try not to let her see people being treated that way. Are you all right? Do you need me to call someone? Or walk you to your car?" Victoria shook her head, a genuine smile finally reaching her eyes for the first time in months. "No, I'm fine, truly. Thank you, Mr. Daniel," he replied. "Just Daniel. Have a better day. Victoria, don't let them ruin your coffee." He didn't ask for her number. He didn't ask what she did for a living or why those men were harassing her. He simply picked up his coffee, took Sophie's hand, and walked out of the shop to get her to school on time. Victoria watched them go through the window, her heart racing for a completely different reason. She had spent her entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted her money, her power, or her influence. She had never met a man who helped her, and then just walked away without asking for a thing. If you think people are sometimes judged too quickly, type, "That's unfair." The next day, Daniel was back in his shop, his head buried in the guts of a vintage 1950s radio. He had already tucked the incident at the coffee shop into the back of his mind. To him, it was just a Tuesday morning. He was focused on the delicate task of replacing a blown capacitor, his hands steady despite the cold London rain tapping rhythmically against his window. Suddenly, the bell at the shop door chimed. Daniel looked up, expecting a neighbor with a broken remote control or a cracked phone screen. Instead, he saw a man in a dark, perfectly tailored suit, wearing a discreet earpiece. The man looked like he belonged in a government convoy, not a repair shop in Camden. "Mr. Daniel Carter?" the man asked, his voice professional, deep and hollow. "That's me," Daniel said, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "Is there a problem? Did I forget a permit?" "Ms. Victoria Blake would like to see you," the man said, gesturing toward a sleek, black limousine idling at the curb. "She has a technical issue she believes only you can resolve. She requested you personally." Daniel was confused. He didn't know a Miss Blake, but curiosity and the sight of the most expensive car he had ever seen in person won out. He locked up his shop, brushed the dust off his jacket, and climbed into the back. 10 minutes later, he was being led through the lobby of the Blake International Tower, a soaring monument of glass and steel that looked like it had been transported from the future. He felt entirely out of place in his work boots and oil-stained jeans as he was led through 3 security checkpoints. He was ushered to the top floor, into an office that was larger than his entire apartment. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic, dizzying view of the London skyline. Standing by the window, her back to him, was the woman from the coffee shop, but she was different now. The hoodie and glasses were gone, replaced by a tailored, sharp-edged navy suit that cost more than Daniel made in a year. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she moved with a confidence that felt like a physical force in the room. Twist 1. The woman in the corner was Victoria Blake, the billionaire CEO of a global empire, a woman whose signature could change the fate of thousands. Daniel stopped in the middle of the room, his mouth slightly open. "Victoria," she turned around, a soft, knowing smile on her face. "Hello again, Daniel. I apologize for the dramatic summons, but I realized yesterday that I never got to thank you properly, and I wanted you to see who you were actually defending." "You don't need to thank me," Daniel said, his voice echoing in the vast, sterile space. "I told you, it was just what anyone should have done. I didn't care if you were a billionaire or a student. You were in trouble. But they didn't, Victoria countered, walking toward him, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Dozens of people in that shop saw me being harassed. They saw 3 men twice my size cornering me. They knew I was in distress. And you, with your daughter's hand in yours, were the only one who didn't calculate the risk. Why? Daniel shrugged. A simple, honest gesture. I told you. My daughter was watching, and I don't like bullies. It doesn't matter if they're in a playground or a boardroom. Victoria looked at him for a long time. She saw the honesty in his eyes. She realized that Daniel still didn't want anything from her. Even now, standing in the middle of her empire, he wasn't looking at the expensive art or the gold-plated furniture with envy. He was looking at her, genuinely worried that she was still upset about the previous day. Twist 2. Victoria revealed that she had intentionally been working in that shop to find a human moment to ground herself. But what she found was the only person who helped her without a motive. I deal with people every day, Daniel, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt intimate in the giant office. People who want my signatures. People who want my investments. People who want to be seen with me so they can feel important. I have built a world where everything is a transaction. I forgot what it felt like to have a heartbeat. But yesterday, for the first time in 10 years, someone helped me because I was a human being in trouble. You didn't even know my last name. You risked a fight for a stranger. She walked to her desk and picked up a small, silver frame. It was a photo of her as a young girl, sitting on her father's shoulders. My father was like you, she said. He didn't have much, but he had a spine made of iron and a heart that couldn't stand an injustice. He died before I made my first million. Since then, I've been looking for that kind of integrity in the men I meet. I thought it was extinct in this city. I thought it had been traded for stock options. Daniel looked at the photo, then at the billionaire. He realized that despite all the glass, the gold, and the power, Victoria was just as lonely as he had been in the first year after his wife died. She had a mountain of money, but she didn't have a neighborhood. She had associates, but she didn't have a quiet fixer. Integrity isn't extinct, Victoria, Daniel said softly. It's just quiet. It doesn't need a skyscraper to stand on to be seen. Victoria was silent. She looked out at the city she owned, and then back at the man who fixed broken radios. She realized that the technical issue she had called him for wasn't a computer, a server, or a satellite. It was her own life. She had been optimized for success, but she had forgotten how to be kind to herself. She had forgotten how to be a person. If you believe quiet professionals deserve credit, type, I owe a debt. Over the next few weeks, the relationship between the billionaire and the single dad began to evolve into something that the London tabloids would never be able to understand. Victoria didn't offer Daniel a high-paying corporate job, and Daniel didn't ask for a single penny in investment for his shop. Instead, they spent time in the places where titles and net worth didn't matter. Victoria started visiting Daniel's shop after the markets closed. She would sit on a wooden stool, her expensive silk dress brushing against the dust of his workbench, watching him work on a prehistoric television or a delicate, antique watch. She loved the sound of the rain on his tin roof and the way he explained the flow of electricity as if it were a beautiful story of connection. You see, Victoria, he said one evening while repairing a 1960s turntable, everything in a circuit has a purpose. If the smallest resistor fails, the music stops. People think the big parts are the most important, but the music lives in the small connections. But most of all, Victoria loved Sophie. Sophie didn't care that Victoria was a billionaire. She didn't care about the Blake International Tower. To Sophie, Victoria was just the lady with the cool glasses who knew a lot about the secret life of the ocean. Victoria would bring Sophie books about coral reefs and deep-sea creatures. And in return, Sophie would teach Victoria how to make friendship bracelets out of spare copper wire and colorful beads from the back of the shop. One evening, as the sun was setting and painting the workshop in shades of amber, Victoria asked Daniel a question that had been burning in her mind since the first day. Daniel, when you stepped in front of those men, weren't you afraid? They were younger. They were stronger. And there were three of them. You could have been seriously hurt. Daniel paused, his soldering iron midair, the glowing tip reflecting in his eyes. He looked at Sophie, who was humming a soft song while organizing a drawer of transistors in the back of the shop. Of course I was afraid, Daniel said, his voice low and steady. But fear is just a feeling, and doing the right thing is a choice. I wanted Sophie to see that choosing the right thing is more important than being safe. If I had let them bully you, I would be telling Sophie that it's okay for men to treat women that way. I'd rather have a black eye or a broken nose than have my daughter lose respect for the man her father is supposed to be. Victoria felt a heavy lump in her throat. I've spent my whole life thinking that power was about control, about being the one who makes the rules and demands the results. But watching you, I realized that true power is just having the courage to be a good man when it's inconvenient and dangerous. Victoria began to change. Her employees noticed it first. The ice queen of Blake International started saying please and thank you. She started looking her interns in the eye. She realized that her corporate process was empty without the human element. She began to use her billions not just to grow her empire, but to fix the broken things in the city, investing in community centers and schools, just like Daniel did in his shop. She realized that Daniel's simple life wasn't a lack of ambition. It was a deliberate choice. He had chosen peace over profit and family over fame. And for the first time in her life, the billionaire CEO found herself deeply envious of a man who fixed broken radios for a living. If you believe kindness can change someone's life, type, I will live kindly. 6 months later, the morning sun is bright and crisp over the London skyline. The park is full of joggers, and the air is filled with the sweet scent of spring blossoms. Inside the Roasted Bean, the same coffee shop where it all began, a table in the corner is occupied. There are no aggressive men today. There are no associates from rival firms. Victoria is sitting with Daniel and Sophie. Victoria looks different, softer, happier, more present. She still runs her multi-billion-dollar empire, but she does it from a place of connection now. She is no longer a ghost in her own life. Beside her, Daniel is laughing at one of Sophie's jokes about a sea anemone who wanted to be a stand-up comedian. Daniel hasn't changed much. He still has the calloused hands and the faded work jacket. He still repairs the neighborhood's broken things with the same patience. But his eyes are brighter, and his shop is a little more organized, thanks to a friend who knows a lot about efficiency and logistics. This story isn't just about a single dad or a billionaire. It's about the fact that sometimes the most important investment you will ever make has nothing to do with a stock market or a profit margin. It's the investment in another human being's dignity. We often think that to change the world, we need a grand title or a massive bank account. We assume that the person at the head of the boardroom table is the one with all the answers. But Daniel Carter proved that a simple technician with a good heart can teach a billionaire more about life than any MBA program. He proved that the best way to lead is to be a father who knows that his daughter is always watching his every move. Sometimes, the world doesn't need a hero with a cape or $1 billion. It just needs a man who is willing to stand up and say, "She asked you to leave." As they finish their drinks, Victoria reaches out and takes Daniel's hand on one side and Sophie's on the other. They walk out of the shop together, three people who found each other in the middle of a storm and decided to build a home in the calm. The voiceover concludes as the camera pans up to the London sky. He thought he was just helping a stranger. She thought no one would ever stand up for her just because she was human. He discovered that integrity doesn't need a price tag. It just needs a witness. Sometimes, the best things in life aren't the ones we buy with gold, but the ones we fix with a little bit of courage and a whole lot of kindness. VM Healing Stories. Final CTA, if this story touched your heart, leave a comment and subscribe to VM Healing Stories. These are the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.